So if we use this paragraph here, which is again really useful to set the zone. So this is the notion of reduction of training intensity. In the third and last part of now classic series of studies, Hickson demonstrated that training intensity is an essential requirement for maintaining training-induced adaptations during periods of reduced training in moderately trained individuals. These authors reported that gains in aerobic power, endurance measures, and cardiac growth attained during 10 weeks of intensive training could not be maintained for a subsequent 15-week period during which training intensity was reduced by 1/3 or 2/3, whereas training volume and frequency remained the same. And so what they've highlighted for us, which is absolutely the case, is that we are trying to maintain adaptation. Remember that fundamentally, as you're going into a taper, the taper is the last part prior to the major competition. So the whole notion of this is it's not about suddenly trying to make the athlete stronger or trying to increase VO2 max or whatever it is. It's fundamentally about that recovery period. So if we were to reduce the intensity, remember that intensity is the primary variable that we deal with in terms of training that drives biological adaptation. So if you take the intensity away, what you're in essence are promoting is a detraining-like effect. So intensity, ironically, has to remain high throughout the period of this taper, despite the fact that we are trying to reduce the training load to bring about physiological and psychological recovery. And what does it look like when we think about kind of the constituents of a taper? Well, the best way to explain this is if we take this data here, which is from a meta-analysis, and what they've done is they've taken a number of studies and they've looked at the effect, the overall effect in terms of performance. And so if we take this panel to the left, what they've got is here is taper duration, and then they've got the effect size here, so they're using a Cohen's d effect size. So remember that with effect sizes, fundamentally anything less than 3 we kind of call trivial, 3 to 5 is small, 5 to 8 is a medium effect, and 5 up and 8 plus, that is 0.8 plus, is considered to be a large effect. So what we see here is that the largest effect, and it's not actually even a large one, it's a medium, but the largest of the effects that they see, the biggest one, is here at 2 weeks, about a 14-day taper. And in fact, if we go shorter than that, it's trivial. And actually, if we go longer than that, we are borderline small into trivial again. So it's kind of suggesting that typically it's about a 14-day taper. And that doesn't mean that all athletes use a 14-day taper, but it kind of gives us a rough idea, particularly if we're planning a taper in an athlete we've never worked with before. It gives us a rough idea about how we may want to structure this initially. Now, remember that in the previous slide, we've reiterated that the variable that remains near as damn it constant, there might be about a 10% reduction, is training intensity. So it means that in essence, the only variables that we can manipulate have to be frequency duration. And remember that frequency duration fundamentally reflect training volume. So it is not surprising then that the authors in this slide here, in this panel here, have referred to the change in training volume, the decrement in training volume. And so what we see here is the overall effect, or the biggest effect, which is pretty much borderline large, so it's pretty meaningful what they're reporting here, is a 41 to 60% reduction in training volume over the course of the taper. So that's over the course of what they have in the panel to the left, which is about a 14-day taper. So it's kind of giving us now the construct of a taper, that we are going to have a taper, as the previous slide said, between 7 and 21 days. It looks like 14 is pretty meaningful, that we're going to keep the intensity fairly constant, probably no more than a 10% reduction, but that what we are going to do is we are going to reduce the training volume. Now, how we achieve that, what is it? Is it the duration, is it the frequency, or both? We're going to reduce the volume to bring about the greatest or the largest overall effect. In other words, get the performance gain. Now, how you then construct that is very much dependent upon the kind of design that you want to take. So there are a number of options, and this is again from a really classic paper published over 20 years ago now by Inigo Mujica. But what it shows us is here we've got taper duration, and here you've got the percentage. So here we've got the kind of the overall design of the taper. So you've got here the percentage of normal training. So here's kind of normal training, we're at 100%, and then we're going into the taper. And so there are really only 3 conventional ways. What we don't do is just do a step reduction. We just don't have this single drop the overall load. It has to be, and you saw that in the previous slides, it has to be what we term a progressive reduction. So it isn't a single reduction in terms of getting. We don't go for this kind of classic just reduce the kind of the overall load. I mean, that's the classic way that you get a kind of a detraining effect, which is what we're trying to avoid. So there are really only 3 major approaches: what's called a linear decay, and then the exponential decay, using either a slow or a fast decay. Very much depends upon the kind of the approach you want to take with your athlete. Conventionally, the easiest approach, not surprisingly, is to use a linear model. Actually, the evidence really between any of these 3 is that they all produce fairly similar results. It's generally recognised that you perhaps get more meaningful performance gains with exponential tapers, but not much more than we would actually see with a linear-like response. But you can see that in essence what they all have in common is that progressive reduction in training load, and in this case it's not done at the expense of intensity, it's being achieved by reducing the training volume. So if we summarize this in terms of our kind of strategy, what is our strategy for the taper? Well, it's fundamentally minimize fatigue without compromising fitness. That's fundamentally number 1, right? If we're compromising fitness, we're losing fitness, then in essence we're detraining the athlete. How do we avoid that? Well, the first thing is you maintain the training intensity. You may afford yourself a 10% reduction over the course of a 14 to 21 day taper, but it's unlikely there's going to be a reduction more than that. You achieve the taper then by reducing training volume by around 60 to 90%. We saw in that previous schematic that the meta-analysis was suggesting about 40 to 41 to 60%. But actually, in that kind of range, even if it goes a little bit lower, from 40 to 90%, it's the volume that you reduce. So the key thing is that you're reducing training volume, but actually, ironically, the way you do it is you keep the training frequency, you don't bring that down too much. So training frequency doesn't really fall by more than 20% over the course of the taper. So the only variable that you're really getting the chance to manipulate to bring the volume down is the training duration per session. You keep the intensity of the reps as they were coming into the taper, but you reduce the duration of time that is devoted to training per session. And then keep the frequency of the sessions. You may have that, say, 20% reduction, but you keep the frequency of the sessions pretty constant. You have a gradual reduction. We talked about taper duration, about 4 to 28 days. Again, a 14-day taper is perhaps a good starting strategy with a novice athlete. We talked about non-linear tapering design, so the exponential tapers seem to produce perhaps better effects than linear, but again, if you're starting out, you've not used tapering strategies before, it is quite simple to program a linear response as opposed to kind of a more exponential decay. And then the gains are around 0.5 to 6% with about an average of 3%. And you think, well, all of this for 3%, but that 3% is the difference potentially in a lot of athletes between first and last place, or not even qualifying for a final. So that's really important to kind of put that in context. That's a big effect. Okay, that is a significant effect in terms of performance.